Nguyen Van Thieu, the last president of South Vietnam. Part 1, Early Life and Background. Nguyen Van Thieu was born on April 5, 1923 in Phan Rang, a small town situated along the south-central coast of Vietnam. This region was known for its dry climate, rugged landscapes, and agricultural communities that primarily relied on rice farming and fishing. Phan Rang, located in Ninh Thuận Province, had long been an area of historical significance, with deep-rooted cultural influences from both the indigenous Cham people and the dominant Vietnamese Kinh ethnic group. Thieu came from a relatively well-off family that had managed to secure a stable living through farming, fishing, and small-scale trading. His father was a small landowner who worked in the fields and engaged in local commerce, while his mother took care of the household and the children. Being the youngest of 5 siblings, Thieu benefited from the support of his elder brothers, who took on various responsibilities to provide for the family. Unlike many Vietnamese children of that era, who were forced to work at a young age due to economic hardships, Thieu was fortunate to have access to formal education, an opportunity that shaped his future ambitions. Childhood and education. From a young age, Thieu exhibited a strong sense of discipline and determination, traits that would later define his leadership style. His early education followed the French colonial curriculum, which was the standard for elite schools in Vietnam during the early 20th century. Despite his Buddhist upbringing, he was enrolled at Pellerin School in Hue, a Catholic-run institution operated by French missionaries. Hue, the imperial capital of the Nguyen dynasty, was a city steeped in tradition and was known for its prestigious educational institutions that primarily served children from privileged backgrounds. Attending a French-administered Catholic school provided Thieu with a rigorous academic foundation, exposing him to Western ideals, military history, and French literature. The school placed great emphasis on discipline, organization, and moral conduct, which had a lasting impact on his personal philosophy. Although he had not yet converted to Catholicism, he was surrounded by Catholic students and teachers, which may have influenced his later decision to embrace the faith. While he excelled in his studies, Thieu's early life was not entirely devoted to academics. When he was not in school, he spent time working in the fields with his father, learning the intricacies of agriculture and rural life. This experience instilled in him a deep understanding of the struggles faced by the Vietnamese peasantry, knowledge that would later shape his policies as a political leader. Despite his privileged education, he never fully detached from his rural roots, maintaining a practical and pragmatic approach to leadership throughout his career. World War II and the Japanese occupation. By the time Thieu reached his teenage years, Vietnam was experiencing political and social upheaval. The French colonial administration had controlled Vietnam since the mid-19th century, but their dominance was beginning to wane. In 1940, following the fall of France to Nazi Germany, the French colonial government in Indochina became significantly weakened. Seizing the opportunity, Imperial Japan invaded and occupied French Indochina in 1941, establishing their presence throughout the region. The war drastically changed the economic and political landscape of Ninh Thuận Province, where Thieu lived. In 1942, Japanese forces took control of Phan Rang, as they did in many other parts of Vietnam. However, unlike in major cities such as Hanoi or Saigon, where anti-colonial resistance movements were more active, the local population in Phan Rang showed minimal resistance. For the most part, people in rural areas remained focused on agriculture and survival, as political conflicts seemed distant and abstract to them. During the Japanese occupation, many Vietnamese were forced to work in harsh conditions to support the Japanese war effort. Rice and other essential goods were heavily taxed and often seized by the Japanese authorities, leading to widespread food shortages and malnutrition. While Thieu and his family were relatively insulated from extreme poverty, the hardships faced by many Vietnamese peasants left a lasting impression on him. He continued working in the rice fields alongside his father, witnessing firsthand the struggles of the common people, which would later influence his views on governance. For the next 3 years, Thieu remained in Phan Rang, dedicating himself to manual labor and observing the growing political tensions within Vietnam. The rural landscape in which he grew up shielded him from the more immediate dangers of war, but he could not escape the broader implications of colonial rule and foreign occupation. The events of World War II made it increasingly clear that Vietnam's colonial subjugation would not last forever, and that profound political change was imminent. The rise of Vietnamese nationalism in the Viet Minh. By 1945, World War II was coming to an end, and the Japanese were losing their grip on Vietnam. On August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrendered to the Allied powers, marking the end of their rule in Indochina. This created a power vacuum, as the French, who had been the previous colonial rulers, had not yet returned in full force. Amid this chaos, the Viet Minh, a revolutionary movement led by Ho Chi Minh, seized the opportunity to proclaim Vietnam's independence. At this critical juncture, Nguyen Van Thieu, like many young Vietnamese men of his generation, became involved in the political struggle for national liberation. At the age of 22, he joined the Viet Minh, which was rapidly gaining support across the country. At the time, the movement was primarily known as an anti-colonial nationalist force, dedicated to freeing Vietnam from foreign rule. Many recruits, including Thieu, were drawn in by the promise of independence and self-determination. In the early days of his involvement with the Viet Minh, Thieu underwent basic military training in jungle clearings, where he and his fellow recruits practiced combat techniques using bamboo sticks instead of rifles, due to a shortage of modern weaponry. As he demonstrated a natural aptitude for leadership, he was quickly promoted to the position of district chief, overseeing local operations in his assigned region. However, Thieu's enthusiasm for the Viet Minh was short-lived. Within a year, he became disillusioned with the movement's increasing alignment with communist ideology. At first, he had believed in the organization's goal of national liberation, but as he witnessed purges, summary executions, and land confiscations, he grew wary of their tactics. The violent suppression of individuals deemed class enemies deeply disturbed him, as it contradicted his personal belief in order and stability. Breaking ties with the Viet Minh. By August 1946, Thieu had made up his mind. He could no longer support the Viet Minh. He defected and fled to Saigon, distancing himself from the increasingly radicalized movement. Years later, he recalled his decision, stating, "By August of 1946, I knew that the Viet Minh were communists. They shot people. They overthrew the village committee. They seized the land." Determined to fight against communism, Thieu sought an alternative path. He enlisted in the Vietnamese National Army, VNA, the military force of the French-backed state of Vietnam, which was established under former Emperor Bao Jai. This marked the beginning of his official military career, setting him on a trajectory that would lead him to positions of increasing power. In the following years, Thieu's experiences in the army would shape his identity as a military leader, politician, and eventual president. His break with the Viet Minh was a pivotal moment, defining his political stance for the rest of his life. His deep-seated anti-communist beliefs became a cornerstone of his ideology, influencing every major decision he made as a leader. Part 2. Military career and rise in the Vietnamese National Army. By 1946, Nguyen Van Thieu had completely severed his ties with the Viet Minh, disillusioned by their increasingly radical communist ideology and brutal methods of maintaining control. As he escaped from the influence of Ho Chi Minh's movement, he sought a new path, one that would allow him to continue fighting for Vietnamese independence, but without aligning himself with communism. This decision led him to Saigon, the political and economic hub of southern Vietnam, where he joined the Vietnamese National Army, VNA, the military force of the French-backed state of Vietnam. At the time, Vietnam was deeply divided, both politically and ideologically. The First Indochina War, 1946-1954, had begun, pitting the Viet Minh against the French colonial authorities and their Vietnamese allies. This conflict was about more than just national liberation. It was also a battle between two opposing visions for the future of Vietnam. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, sought to establish a communist state, while the state of Vietnam, backed by France, was formed as an alternative government under Emperor Bao Jai. For Thiệu, aligning with the French-backed government was not an easy choice given Vietnam's long history of colonial subjugation. However, he viewed communism as a greater threat than French imperialism. Like many other conservative and nationalist Vietnamese, he believed that collaborating with France temporarily was a necessary step toward eventual full sovereignty. At the time, the French were promising increased autonomy for the state of Vietnam, and Thiệu saw an opportunity to rise within the ranks and help build a non-communist, independent Vietnam. Enlistment in the Vietnamese National Army. Once enrolled in the Vietnamese National Army, VNA, Thiệu was sent to military training school to undergo officer training. With the support of his older brother, Nguyễn Văn Thiệu, a Paris-trained lawyer who held an influential position in the government, Thiệu was initially placed in the Merchant Marine Academy. The academy, based in Saigon, trained officers for maritime service, but Thiệu quickly realized that this was not the right path for him. His decision to leave the academy was driven by a sense of injustice. He discovered that Vietnamese officers in the Merchant Marine were being paid significantly less than their French colleagues, reinforcing his suspicions about the French colonial system. Frustrated by this inequality, he abandoned his maritime training and transferred to the National Military Academy in Gia, where he formally began his career as a soldier. Military training and early service. Thieu's time at the National Military Academy in Gia was a defining period in his early military career. The academy, established in 1950, was modeled after French military schools and was considered the premier institution for training Vietnamese officers. The rigorous curriculum combined theoretical instruction with practical military exercises, covering subjects such as battlefield tactics, leadership principles, and logistics. Thiệu excelled in his studies, and in 1949 he graduated as a second lieutenant, part of the first batch of commissioned officers in the Vietnamese National Army. As one of the earliest graduates, he was among the first generation of Vietnamese military leaders who would shape the nation's armed forces in the years to come. Following his commissioning, Thiệu was assigned to an infantry platoon, where he was responsible for commanding a small group of soldiers engaged in counterinsurgency operations against the Viet Minh. His first years in combat were spent fighting guerrilla forces in the countryside, as the war against the communist insurgency intensified. During this time, the French military advisors closely supervised the Vietnamese National Army, as they still viewed it as a supporting force rather than an independent entity. While the Vietnamese officers were being trained to take on leadership roles, the real command authority still rested in the hands of the French. This frustrated many ambitious young officers, including Thiệu, who resented the fact that Vietnamese commanders were often sidelined in favor of their French counterparts. Despite these challenges, Thiệu quickly rose through the ranks, gaining a reputation for being a cautious but effective strategist. Unlike some of his more aggressive peers, he preferred to only engage in battle when victory seemed assured, a trait that some admired as pragmatic, but others criticized as overly cautious. Advanced military training in France and the United States. As part of the French efforts to modernize and expand the Vietnamese National Army, many promising young officers were sent abroad for specialized military training. In the early 1950s, Thiệu was selected for an officer training program in France, where he studied at the infantry school in Coëtquidan. This experience exposed him to Western military doctrines, giving him a deeper understanding of modern warfare tactics. Upon his return to Vietnam, Thieu's leadership abilities earned him a place in Staff College in Hanoi, where he continued his education in military strategy and operational command. His training in France and Hanoi helped him develop a structured and analytical approach to warfare, which later became evident during his leadership in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Thieu's education was further enhanced when he was sent to the United States for additional military training. Between 1957 and 1960, he attended courses at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he studied command and general staff operations. He also underwent weapons training at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later participated in strategic planning programs at the Joint and Combined Planning School of the Pacific Command in Okinawa, Japan. These experiences deepened his military expertise and broadened his perspective on modern military tactics, making him one of the most well-trained officers in the Vietnamese army. However, his exposure to Western military doctrines also reinforced his skepticism toward foreign powers. He saw firsthand how foreign military assistance often came with political strings attached, and this would later shape his complex relationship with the United States during his presidency. Combat against the Viet Minh. By the early 1950s, Thiệu had risen to the rank of major, leading infantry battalions in counterinsurgency operations. One of his most notable battles occurred in 1954, when he commanded a battalion that successfully expelled Viet Minh forces from Phan Rang, his hometown. The battle was a significant test of his strategic skills and leadership, as the communists had established a stronghold in the region. When the Viet Minh retreated, they took shelter in Thieu's childhood home, believing that he would be reluctant to attack his own property. However, to their surprise, he ordered an assault on the house, prioritizing military success over personal sentiment. This action demonstrated his pragmatic and often ruthless approach to warfare, characteristics that would later define his presidency. The fall of the French and the birth of South Vietnam. The decisive moment in Vietnam's modern history came in 1954, when the French were defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Following their surrender, the Geneva Accords were signed, leading to the withdrawal of French forces from Vietnam and the formal division of the country into North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and South Vietnam, under Emperor Bao Jai. With the French gone, the Vietnamese National Army VNA was reorganized into the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, marking a transition toward an independent South Vietnamese military. Thiệu, now an established military officer, continued to climb the ranks, eventually becoming a lieutenant colonel. During this period, a new political leader emerged in South Vietnam, Ngô Đình Diệm, a staunchly anti-communist Catholic politician. Supported by the United States, Diem overthrew Bao Jai in a 1955 referendum, establishing himself as the President of the Republic of Vietnam. Thiệu, like many other officers, pledged loyalty to Diem's government, seeing him as a bulwark against communism. However, tensions within the military and government soon led to instability, and Thiệu found himself increasingly entangled in South Vietnam's complex political struggles. Part 3, Rising Through the Ranks, Political and Military Ascendancy in South Vietnam. By the mid-1950s, Nguyễn Văn Thiệu had firmly established himself as a rising military officer in the newly formed Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, the National Military Force of South Vietnam. His decision to join the anti-communist government under President Ngô Đình Diệm marked a turning point in his career. Under Diem's leadership, South Vietnam sought to consolidate power, eliminate internal threats, and establish a functioning, pro-Western government with backing from the United States. During this period, Thiệu transitioned from a battlefield commander to an influential figure within the military hierarchy. While he had previously focused on tactical warfare against the Viet Minh, his role increasingly involved political maneuvering, leadership development, and strategic planning. As South Vietnam struggled with internal divisions and external communist threats, Thieu's cautious but methodical approach helped him navigate a turbulent era, positioning himself for even greater power in the years to come. The rise of Ngô Đình Diệm and South Vietnam's new leadership. The formation of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, in 1955 signaled a decisive break from French colonial rule and ushered in a new era under President Ngô Đình Diệm, who was backed by the United States. Diem, a devout Catholic nationalist, was determined to centralize power, suppress internal dissent, and combat the growing communist insurgency that was emerging in South Vietnam. Diem's rule was characterized by authoritarian policies, suppression of political opponents, and an unwavering reliance on family loyalty and religious favoritism. While many saw him as an anti-communist strongman, others viewed him as a divisive figure whose rule alienated large segments of the population, particularly Buddhists who resented his pro-Catholic favoritism. During this time, Nguyễn Văn Thiệu, who had not yet converted to Catholicism, remained loyal to Diem, As a rising military officer, he understood the importance of aligning with the president to advance his career. In 1956, he was appointed head of the National Military Academy in Jalat, South Vietnam's premier training institution for young officers. This was a prestigious position that allowed him to mentor future ARVN leaders and build a network of loyal military officers, many of whom would later serve under him during his presidency. While at the academy, Thiệu was responsible for overhauling officer training programs, implementing counterinsurgency tactics, and emphasizing loyalty to the government. His leadership style was strict and disciplined, favoring a cautious, methodical approach rather than rash or overly aggressive strategies. He placed great emphasis on building morale among the troops, understanding that South Vietnam's military needed to develop a strong national identity to counteract communist influence. During his tenure as head of the academy, Thiệu also furthered his military education by attending additional training programs in the United States. This exposure to Western military strategy enhanced his understanding of modern warfare and deepened his awareness of the geopolitical significance of Vietnam's conflict within the larger Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Buddhist crisis and internal military tensions. Despite his loyalty to Diem, Thiệu was aware of growing unrest within the country. By the early 1960s, opposition to Diem's rule was intensifying, particularly among Buddhists, who felt marginalized under his Catholic-dominated administration. The Buddhist crisis of 1963 erupted after government forces opened fire on Buddhist protesters in Hue, leading to mass demonstrations, violent crackdowns, and widespread condemnation of Diem's government. As the crisis escalated, South Vietnam's military leadership became increasingly divided. Many senior officers, particularly those who were Buddhist, felt that Diem's oppressive policies were destabilizing the country and strengthening communist recruitment efforts in rural areas. However, Thiệu remained publicly loyal to Diem during this period, even as tensions between the military and the government deepened. At the same time, Thiệu was also quietly positioning himself for future opportunities. While he did not initially oppose Diem outright, he began networking with other officers who were frustrated with the regime's policies. His approach was characteristically cautious. He did not openly support coup attempts, but he also avoided alienating his fellow officers who were considering action against the president. In November 1960, a group of military officers, led by Colonels Vuong Van Dong and Nguyen Chan Thi, launched a coup attempt against Diem. The rebels, dissatisfied with Diem's autocratic rule, sought to force him into power-sharing negotiations. Thiệu, who was then a lieutenant colonel commanding the 7th Infantry Division, played a key role in crushing the coup. He ordered his forces to intervene in support of Diem, reinforcing the president's control over the government. This act of loyalty was rewarded. Thiệu was promoted to brigadier general and given greater responsibilities within the ARVN. However, his participation in suppressing the coup did not mean that he was entirely devoted to Diem's cause. Rather, his actions reflected his pragmatic approach. He understood that siding with a failed coup attempt could end his career, while reinforcing the government's authority would strengthen his standing within the military. The 1963 coup and the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem. Despite Diem's survival in 1960, opposition to his rule continued to grow, especially after the Buddhist crisis of 1963. By mid-1963, military officers, including Generals Duong Van Minh, Tran Van Duong, and Le Van Kim, were actively plotting to overthrow the president. Thiệu, who had previously supported the government, was now faced with a difficult choice: remain loyal to a weakening leader or join the growing ranks of officers who sought to remove Diem from power. In November 1963, Thiệu made his decision. He joined the coup against Diem. As a key military commander, he played a direct role in the siege of Gia Long Palace, the presidential residence in Saigon. His troops were among those who surrounded the palace, forcing Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, to flee into hiding. Following the coup, Diem and Nhu were captured and executed, despite having been promised safe exile. The circumstances surrounding their assassination remain controversial, with some historians suggesting that it was orchestrated by senior generals who wanted to eliminate any possibility of Diem's return to power. Thiệu, who was present during the coup, later denied responsibility for Diem's death, instead placing the blame on General Duong Văn Minh, the leader of the military junta that replaced Diem. Although he had turned against Diem, Thieu's role in the post-coup government was initially limited. He was promoted to general, but power was largely concentrated in the hands of Duong Văn Minh and other senior officers. However, as South Vietnam descended into political instability, Thieu's cautious approach allowed him to survive the turbulent period that followed Diem's fall. Over the next 2 years, South Vietnam was plagued by military infighting, frequent coups, and weak leadership. Thieu skillfully navigated this environment, steadily rising in influence while avoiding direct involvement in the power struggles that consumed many of his fellow officers. By 1965, he had emerged as one of the most powerful generals in the country, positioning himself as a potential national leader. In this period of his life, Nguyễn Văn Thiệu transitioned from a military officer to a political figure, playing a key role in the downfall of Ngô Đình Diệm, while carefully avoiding direct entanglement in the post-coup chaos. His ability to maneuver through political instability and maintain military influence allowed him to rise steadily through the ranks, setting the stage for his eventual leadership of South Vietnam. Part 4. The Path to the Presidency. Political Maneuvering and Military Consolidation, 1963-1967. After the November 1963 coup that resulted in the assassination of President Ngô Đình Diệm, South Vietnam entered a period of extreme political instability. The country saw a rapid succession of short-lived governments, power struggles between military factions, and continued deterioration in the fight against the communist Viet Cong. It was during this time that Nguyễn Văn Thiệu, a cautious yet ambitious general, steadily positioned himself as a dominant figure in both the military and political spheres. Through careful maneuvering, strategic alliances, and an ability to outlast rival generals, Thiệu emerged as one of the most powerful men in South Vietnam by 1965. By 1967, after a series of coups and military takeovers, he had managed to secure the presidency in an election that was widely viewed as rigged. His rise to power was neither swift nor inevitable. It was the result of tactical patience, political survival, and calculated decisions that allowed him to outmaneuver competitors during a chaotic period in South Vietnamese history. Post-Diem chaos and the struggle for control, 1963-1965. Following Diem's assassination, South Vietnam was initially ruled by a 12-member Military Revolutionary Council, MRC, led by General Duong Văn Minh. However, the MRC was plagued by factional infighting, and the government remained weak and unstable. Thiệu, who had played a role in the coup against Diem, was rewarded with a position on the ruling council as its Secretary General, giving him a foothold in the country's leadership. Despite being a rising figure in the military junta, Thiệu took a cautious approach. While some of his peers engaged in bold power grabs, he remained reserved and strategic, waiting for the right opportunities to increase his influence without directly challenging the ruling factions. This method of quietly positioning himself as a stable and reliable figure allowed him to survive multiple leadership changes that saw other generals fall from power. The fall of Duong Văn Minh and Nguyen Khan's rule. By January 1964, General Nguyen Khan launched a coup against Duong Văn Minh, overthrowing him and installing himself as South Vietnam's new leader. Khan, a charismatic and politically ambitious general, sought to consolidate power by sidelining rivals and attempting to create a strong central government. Thiệu remained loyal to Khan at first, but he kept his distance from factional disputes. When a series of power struggles erupted between Khan's supporters and rival generals, Thiệu refrained from taking a clear side. His ability to avoid becoming entangled in internal conflicts allowed him to remain in a strong position, even as Khan's regime became increasingly unpopular. By September 1964, South Vietnam experienced another coup attempt, led by Generals Lam Văn Phát and Duong Văn Duc. During this crisis, Thieu's passive stance was interpreted as tacit support for the coup plotters. The coup eventually failed, and Khan remained in power, but the instability further weakened the government. The rise of Nguyen Chao Ki and Nguyen Van Thieu in 1965 coup. By early 1965, Nguyen Khan's leadership had collapsed, and he was forced out of power by a group of younger military officers. This created an opportunity for two rising figures, Air Marshal Nguyen Cao Ki and General Nguyen Van Thieu, to take control of South Vietnam. Cai, a brash and flamboyant Air Force officer, became the prime minister, while Thieu, a more cautious and calculating figure, took the ceremonial role of chief of state. Although Cai was the more visible and vocal leader, it was Thieu's quiet maneuvering that would ultimately allow him to outlast Cai and assume full control of the government. Under Cai and Thieu's joint leadership, South Vietnam experienced a temporary period of stability after years of coups and government collapses. They suppressed political dissent, strengthened the military, and maintained the support of the United States, which was becoming more directly involved in the war following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The 1967 presidential election, Thieu's power grab, as South Vietnam's political system transitioned toward an elected government, a presidential election was scheduled for 1967. Despite their previous alliance, both Thieu and Cai wanted the presidency, leading to a power struggle between the two men. Although Cai was the more popular and dynamic leader, Thieu was able to outmaneuver him politically. To resolve the leadership conflict, South Vietnam's military high command forced the two men to run on a joint ticket, with Thieu as presidential candidate and Cai as his running mate. While the military generals publicly endorsed this compromise, Thieu privately worked to weaken Cai's influence, ensuring that power would be concentrated in his own hands. The election itself was widely seen as rigged. The government restricted political opposition, making it nearly impossible for other candidates to compete fairly. In the end, Thieu and Cai won the election, with Thieu becoming president of South Vietnam on September 3, 1967. Although Cai was still vice president, Thieu immediately began sidelining his former ally, removing Cai's supporters from key military and government positions. Over time, Thieu successfully weakened Cai's influence, forcing him into political irrelevance. Thieu's early presidency, consolidation of power, 1967-1968. Once in power, Thieu focused on consolidating his authority and strengthening South Vietnam's government. His presidency began at a time when the Vietnam War was escalating, with increasing American involvement and mounting casualties. To solidify his rule, Thieu took several key actions. Political suppression. Thieu cracked down on opposition groups, restricting press freedoms and censoring criticism of his government. He arrested political opponents and neutralized potential threats within the military and administration. Military loyalty and reorganization. He appointed loyalists to key positions in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. He purged officers suspected of disloyalty, ensuring that the army remained firmly under his control. Economic and social policies. Thieu introduced land reforms aimed at winning the support of rural farmers, though these policies had limited success. He sought to stabilize the economy, but corruption within his government weakened many of his initiatives. Despite his authoritarian approach, Thieu projected an image of stability, which was important in maintaining American support. However, his grip on power would soon be tested as South Vietnam faced one of its greatest challenges, the 1968 Tet Offensive. By 1967, Nguyen Van Thieu had successfully navigated the chaotic political landscape of South Vietnam to become president. Through calculated political maneuvering, suppression of rivals, and military control, he was able to eliminate competition and consolidate power. However, as his presidency began, South Vietnam remained fragile, and his leadership would soon face a severe test with the Tet Offensive in 1968, a massive communist attack that would shake the foundation of his government and change the course of the Vietnam War. Part 5, the Tet Offensive and its aftermath, in 1968-1969. By 1968, Nguyễn Văn Thiệu had successfully consolidated political power in South Vietnam after securing the presidency in 1967. Despite internal political struggles, military infighting, and widespread corruption, his government remained intact, supported largely by American military and economic aid. However, Thieu's leadership faced its most severe test when the Communist forces launched the Tet Offensive, a large-scale surprise attack that shook South Vietnam and exposed the vulnerabilities of Thieu's rule. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 was a turning point in the Vietnam War, demonstrating the ability of the Communist forces to strike at the heart of South Vietnam's cities, including Saigon. While the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, and U.S. military eventually repelled the attacks, the offensive had profound political and psychological effects, both in South Vietnam and in the United States. Although it was technically a military failure for the North Vietnamese, the offensive dealt a devastating blow to the morale of the South Vietnamese people, weakened Thieu's credibility, and led to growing doubts about the war effort among American policymakers. Prelude to the Tet Offensive, 1967-1968, growing instability. Before the Tet Offensive, South Vietnam was already experiencing severe instability. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had been intensifying guerrilla warfare in rural areas, increasing assassinations of South Vietnamese officials, and launching coordinated attacks on government positions. The United States had escalated its military involvement, with more than 500,000 American troops stationed in Vietnam by the end of 1967. Thieu's government faced several major challenges: political divisions and corruption. His administration was plagued by corruption, with officials and military officers embezzling American aid. Infighting between political factions within the military weakened the overall war effort. His former ally, Nguyen Cao Khai, still had supporters in the military, creating tensions within his government. Low morale in the ARVN. Many ARVN soldiers were poorly paid, under-equipped, and had low morale due to corruption among commanders. ARVN units often struggled to maintain discipline, especially in rural areas where they faced constant Viet Cong attacks. The Communist Strategy. North Vietnam's leadership, led by Le Duan and General Vo Nguyen Giap, planned the Tet Offensive as a coordinated nationwide attack designed to trigger a popular uprising in South Vietnam. They hoped that mass attacks on urban centers would lead to a collapse of the South Vietnamese government, forcing the United States to withdraw. Despite warnings from intelligence sources, Thieu and his military advisors failed to anticipate the scale of the impending attack. The Tet holiday, Lunar New Year, was traditionally a time of ceasefire, and South Vietnamese forces were relaxed and unprepared when the offensive began. The Tet Offensive, Communist attacks on South Vietnam, January-February 1968. In the early morning hours of January 30-31, 1968, during the Tet holiday, over 80,000 communist troops launched simultaneous surprise attacks on more than 100 cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam. Key battles during the Tet Offensive: attack on Saigon. Communist forces penetrated the capital, attacking the presidential palace, the U.S. Embassy, Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and other key locations. Thieu was not in Saigon when the attack occurred. He was celebrating Tet with his family in Mai Tho. Vice President Nguyen Cao Khai took command of Saigon's defenses, organizing counterattacks to push the Viet Cong back. Battle of Hue, January-February 1968. Hue, the imperial capital, was captured by North Vietnamese forces, who held it for nearly a month. The communists executed thousands of civilians, including government officials, teachers, and suspected anti-communists. The ARVN and U.S. Marines engaged in brutal house-to-house combat to retake the city, suffering heavy casualties. Fighting in other cities. Cities like Da Nang, Nha Trang, and Can Tho saw heavy fighting. Many rural South Vietnamese villages were completely destroyed as ARVN and U.S. forces retaliated. While the ARVN and U.S. forces eventually repelled the communist attacks, the battle had exposed major weaknesses in South Vietnam's ability to defend itself. Thio's response to the Tet Offensive. Despite the chaos and destruction, Thio declared victory, arguing that the communists had failed to achieve their goal of overthrowing the government. Militarily, his claim was somewhat valid. The Viet Cong had suffered heavy casualties, and their hopes of triggering a popular uprising had failed. However, the political impact of the offensive was devastating. Public confidence in Thio declined. Many South Vietnamese lost trust in Thio's leadership, as the government appeared weak and unprepared. Civilians were angered by the slow military response and the widespread destruction of urban areas. Rising tensions between Thio and the U.S. The Tet Offensive shattered American confidence in the war effort. Many U.S. officials began questioning whether South Vietnam could survive without American support. Anti-war sentiment in the United States grew rapidly, leading to political pressure to reduce American involvement. Thio declared martial law and mobilized more troops. In February 1968, he declared martial law and increased military conscription to replenish ARVN losses. This increased the size of the South Vietnamese army, but morale remained low. Repression of opposition groups. Thio used the crisis to crack down on opposition figures, arresting journalists, political activists, and Buddhist leaders who had been critical of his government. Aftermath of the Tet Offensive. The beginning of U.S. disengagement. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the Tet Offensive was the shift in U.S. policy toward reducing military involvement in Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson was politically damaged by the offensive, leading him to announce in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. The U.S. government began considering negotiations with North Vietnam. The new U.S. President, Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, developed a strategy called Vietnamization, which aimed to gradually withdraw American troops and shift responsibility for the war to South Vietnam's military. For Thio, this meant that he would soon have to fight the war with less direct U.S. military support. Although the U.S. still provided weapons, funding, and training, the gradual withdrawal of American troops placed a heavy burden on his government and military. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was a pivotal moment in Nguyen Van Thio's presidency. While it was a military failure for the communists, it weakened public confidence in his leadership, accelerated U.S. disengagement, and deepened political instability in South Vietnam. As U.S. troops began withdrawing, Thio now faced the enormous challenge of leading South Vietnam's military against a determined communist enemy without direct American combat support. Part 6. The Nixon Years in Vietnamization, 1969-1973. By 1969, Nguyen Van Thieu had survived the Tet Offensive and remained firmly in control of the South Vietnamese government. However, the aftermath of the offensive had profoundly changed the dynamics of the Vietnam War. While the communist forces had been militarily defeated, the offensive had shattered American confidence in the war effort, leading to a dramatic shift in U.S. policy. With the election of Richard Nixon as U.S. President in November 1968, the United States began implementing a new strategy, Vietnamization, a policy designed to gradually withdraw American troops and shift the responsibility for the war to South Vietnam's military. For Thieu, this meant that he would now be forced to fight the war with fewer U.S. troops, relying increasingly on American military aid, South Vietnamese forces, and his own leadership. During this period, Thieu focused on strengthening the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, consolidating political power, and navigating a complex relationship with the Nixon administration. His government became more authoritarian, cracking down on political dissent while attempting to reassure the South Vietnamese public that they could still win the war, even as the Americans began disengaging. The Nixon Doctrine and Vietnamization, 1969-1972. In mid-1969, President Richard Nixon announced a new approach to the war. His Nixon Doctrine emphasized reducing direct U.S. military involvement while continuing to provide financial and military support to allies. The key component of this new strategy was Vietnamization, which aimed to strengthen the ARVN so that South Vietnam could fight independently. Gradually withdraw American troops, reducing U.S. casualties and political pressure at home, increased bombing campaigns to pressure North Vietnam into negotiations. While Nixon publicly assured Thieu that the U.S. would continue supporting South Vietnam, the reality was more complex. The American public had grown increasingly opposed to the war, and Nixon faced mounting pressure to bring American troops home. Between 1969 and 1972, U.S. forces in Vietnam declined from over 500,000 to fewer than 30,000 troops. As the withdrawals accelerated, Thieu was forced to take full control of the war effort, despite ongoing weaknesses in the ARVN. Thieu's response to Vietnamization, massive military expansion. Thieu increased the size of the ARVN, expanding the military to over 1 million troops. American weapons, tanks, and aircraft were transferred to South Vietnam to make up for the loss of U.S. troops. U.S. military advisors trained ARVN officers in more advanced tactics. Authoritarian rule and political crackdowns. With the war still raging, Thieu tightened his grip on power, arresting political opponents, journalists, and student activists. He implemented martial law in certain regions, suppressing anti-war protests. His government controlled the media, censoring criticism of his leadership. Corruption and mismanagement. As U.S. aid flooded into South Vietnam, corruption worsened. Some ARVN officers stole supplies, resold American weapons, and misused funds meant for soldiers. Many soldiers were poorly paid and under-equipped, leading to desertions and morale problems. Despite these issues, Thieu publicly maintained that Vietnamization was a success. He praised Nixon's strategy, reassuring the South Vietnamese people that they would be able to defend their country without direct American combat support. 1971 presidential election, a rigged victory. By 1971, South Vietnam was preparing for another presidential election. Although Thieu had originally come to power in 1967 with Nguyen Chau Qui as his running mate, their relationship had deteriorated over the years. Khai, once a powerful figure, had been sidelined and humiliated by Thieu, who had gradually removed Khai's supporters from the military and government. For the 1971 election, Thieu ensured that the race was completely unopposed. He passed laws restricting political candidates, barring strong opponents. Intimidated and pressured rival politicians, forcing them to drop out. Used government-controlled media to attack any potential challengers. As a result, every serious competitor withdrew, leaving Thieu as the only candidate. On October 1971, he won 100% of the vote, an election widely viewed as a sham. Even the United States, which had supported Thieu, saw the election as illegitimate. Although the election victory gave him absolute power, it also further damaged his reputation, both at home and internationally. His rule became even more autocratic, and opposition to his leadership grew among students, Buddhist leaders, and even members of the ARVN. The Easter Offensive, 1972, a test of Thieu's leadership. While Thieu was dealing with internal opposition and a shrinking U.S. presence, the Communist forces launched a massive invasion of South Vietnam in early 1972. This attack, known as the Easter Offensive, was the largest North Vietnamese military operation since the Tet Offensive of 1968. Unlike previous guerrilla-style attacks, the Easter Offensive was a conventional military invasion, with over 120,000 North Vietnamese troops using tanks, artillery, and heavy weapons to attack South Vietnam from 3 directions. Northern Front, Quang Tri Province. North Vietnamese forces captured Quang Tri City within weeks. Central Highlands, Con Tum and Pleiku. The ARVN suffered heavy losses as the Communists tried to cut South Vietnam in half. Southern Front, An Loc, near Saigon. Fierce fighting took place only 100 km from Saigon, with heavy ARVN casualties. Thieu's controversial military decisions. During the Easter Offensive, Thieu's leadership was heavily criticized. He personally micromanaged military operations, often contradicting his own generals. He hesitated to send reinforcements to embattled cities, leading to unnecessary losses. He distrusted his own commanders, frequently replacing generals in the middle of battles. Despite these setbacks, U.S. air power played a decisive role. President Nixon ordered massive airstrikes, including Operation Linebacker, which helped push back North Vietnamese forces. With continued American air support, ARVN forces eventually recaptured lost territory, but at a huge cost in casualties. The Easter Offensive exposed major weaknesses in the South Vietnamese military, showing that even with U.S. weapons, ARVN forces struggled to defend their country alone. The Paris Peace Accords 1973 and U.S. withdrawal. By 1973, under increasing pressure from the American anti-war movement, President Nixon pushed for a negotiated settlement to the war. The result was the Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, which called for a ceasefire between North and South Vietnam, allowed the U.S. to withdraw its remaining troops from Vietnam, permitted North Vietnamese forces to remain in the South, controlling occupied areas. Thiệu was deeply opposed to the peace deal, calling it a betrayal. However, Nixon forced him to accept the terms by threatening to cut off all U.S. aid. With the U.S. military now completely gone, South Vietnam was left to fight on its own against the communists. Thiệu, despite putting on a brave face, knew that his country's survival was now in serious jeopardy. Between 1969 and 1973, Thieu's rule became more authoritarian. The Vietnamization policy failed to create a self-sufficient ARVN, and the U.S. withdrawal left South Vietnam increasingly vulnerable. As Thiệu struggled to maintain control, North Vietnam prepared for its final offensive, setting the stage for the collapse of South Vietnam in 1975. Part 7. The Fall of South Vietnam, 1973-1975. By 1973, Nguyễn Văn Thiệu was facing the greatest crisis of his presidency. The United States had fully withdrawn its combat troops after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, leaving South Vietnam to fight on its own against the ever-strengthening communist forces of North Vietnam. Although the agreement had officially declared a ceasefire, in reality, the war never stopped. North Vietnam continued military operations, strengthening its presence in territories it controlled, while Thieu's government, despite receiving U.S. financial and military aid, struggled to maintain control over the country. Over the next 2 years, South Vietnam's economy crumbled, military morale collapsed, and U.S. aid dwindled, all while the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, prepared for its final offensive. By April 1975, Thieu's government had completely fallen apart, leading to the total collapse of South Vietnam in the fall of Saigon. Post-Paris Peace Accords, the struggle to hold South Vietnam, 1973-1974. After the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, Thiệu attempted to project an image of stability, telling the South Vietnamese people that they could win the war without American combat forces. However, his government immediately faced 3 major challenges. 1. The North Vietnamese violations of the ceasefire. North Vietnam never intended to honor the ceasefire. They used the peace agreement as an opportunity to build up their forces in the South. The NVA expanded its logistical network, stockpiling weapons, ammunition, and supplies for a future final offensive. 2. The collapse of the South Vietnamese economy. With the withdrawal of U.S. forces, South Vietnam lost billions of dollars in American spending that had supported its economy. Unemployment surged, inflation skyrocketed, and government workers went unpaid for months. Corruption worsened as officials stole U.S. aid money, further weakening public confidence in Thieu's leadership. 3. The reduction of U.S. military aid. In 1973-74, U.S. Congress significantly reduced financial aid to South Vietnam. ARVN forces suffered from ammunition shortages, fuel shortages, and limited air support. With fewer resources, ARVN commanders could not effectively defend territory against communist attacks. Despite these challenges, Thiệu continued to publicly declare confidence in victory, but behind closed doors, he knew South Vietnam was in deep trouble. The communist offensive begins. The fall of Phuoc Long, December 1974, January 1975. As South Vietnam's military grew weaker, North Vietnam prepared its final push. In December 1974, they launched an attack on Phuoc Long province, just 120 kilometers from Saigon. North Vietnam's strategy. The attack on Phuoc Long was a test to see how Thiệu and the U.S. would respond. If the U.S. sent airstrikes or reinforcements, North Vietnam would hold back. If the U.S. did nothing, it would signal that South Vietnam was on its own. Thieu's response and the U.S. abandonment. Thiệu pleaded with Washington for help, but the U.S. did nothing. President Gerald Ford, who replaced Nixon after his resignation in 1974, refused to intervene. On January 6, 1975, Phuoc Long fell to the Communists, the first South Vietnamese province to be permanently lost. This confirmed North Vietnam's belief that the U.S. would no longer defend South Vietnam, giving them the green light to launch a full-scale invasion. The Central Highlands disaster, March 1975, the beginning of the end. After the fall of Phuoc Long, North Vietnam planned its final offensive. Their next major target was Ban Ma Thuot, the largest city in the Central Highlands. Thieu's fatal mistake, the abandonment of the Central Highlands. Instead of defending Ban Ma Thuot, Thiệu made a shocking decision. He ordered a full retreat from the entire Central Highlands. He believed that by abandoning weaker areas, he could concentrate forces on defending Saigon and key coastal cities. However, this decision was catastrophic. Mass chaos during the retreat. The withdrawal was poorly organized, leading to panic and disorder among ARVN troops and civilians. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers fled in disarray, abandoning weapons, vehicles, and ammunition. Hundreds of thousands of civilians tried to escape with the retreating army, leading to massacres, starvation, and suffering. The North Vietnamese took advantage. Seeing South Vietnam in chaos, the NVA moved quickly. By late March 1975, they seized all of the Central Highlands, dealing a devastating psychological blow to the ARVN. This disaster weakened Thieu's credibility, as many in the ARVN blamed him for the chaotic retreat. The rapid collapse of South Vietnam, April 1975. After the fall of the Central Highlands, North Vietnam accelerated its attack. Key communist victories. Hue Falls, March 25, 1975. The former imperial capital was overrun after ARVN forces collapsed under heavy attack. Da Nang Falls, March 29, 1975. South Vietnam's second-largest city was captured after ARVN troops deserted and civilians tried to flee in mass panic. Nha Trang Quy Nhon and Cam Ranh Bay Fall, April 2 to 3, 1975. The entire South Vietnamese coastline collapsed, leaving Saigon isolated. By mid-April 1975, North Vietnam had destroyed most of the ARVN's best divisions, leaving only Saigon and the Mekong Delta under Thieu's control. Thieu's resignation and escape, April 21, 1975. With Saigon surrounded and his government falling apart, Thieu finally resigned on April 21, 1975. His resignation speech. In a televised address, Thieu blamed the United States, saying, "The United States did not keep its word. It is inhumane. It is irresponsible. You Americans with your 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, you were not defeated. You ran away." Thieu's escape. On April 25, 1975, Thieu fled South Vietnam, first flying to Taiwan, then later to London in the United States. He left behind Prime Minister Tran Van Huong, who quickly transferred power to Duong Van Minh, the last South Vietnamese president. The fall of Saigon, April 30, 1975. The end of South Vietnam. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, officially marking the end of the Republic of Vietnam. Duong Van Minh surrendered to the communists. The ARVN completely collapsed. Many soldiers fled, surrendered, or were executed. Thousands of South Vietnamese tried to escape by boat or by U.S. helicopter in the chaotic Saigon evacuation. The war was over. South Vietnam had ceased to exist. Nguyen Van Thieu's leadership ended in failure. As South Vietnam collapsed under his rule, his poor military decisions, corruption, and over-reliance on U.S. aid all contributed to the fall of his country. After escaping Vietnam, Thieu lived in exile for the rest of his life, bitterly blaming the United States for abandoning South Vietnam. Part 8, Life in exile, 1975-2001. After fleeing South Vietnam in April 1975, Nguyen Van Thieu lived the rest of his life in exile, far from the country he had once ruled. Though he had once been the most powerful man in South Vietnam, directing the war effort and commanding an entire nation, he now found himself a man without a country, haunted by the fall of Saigon and the collapse of his government. Thieu's years in exile were characterized by bitterness, isolation, and deep resentment toward the United States, which he believed had betrayed South Vietnam. Despite attempts to remain politically active within the Vietnamese diaspora, he largely withdrew from public life, living quietly in Taiwan, London, and eventually the United States. Though he rarely spoke publicly, Thieu remained a controversial figure, blamed by many South Vietnamese exiles for his authoritarian rule, corruption, and poor military leadership. He spent his final years in Massachusetts, living a reclusive life, before passing away in 2001. Fleeing Vietnam, Thieu's escape from Saigon, April 1975. As communist forces closed in on Saigon, Thieu faced enormous pressure to resign and flee the country. His own generals, frustrated with his leadership, urged him to leave, believing that his continued presence would only worsen the situation. Thieu's departure and the gold controversy. On April 21, 1975, Thieu officially resigned from the presidency, blaming the United States for abandoning South Vietnam. On April 25th, Thieu secretly boarded a military transport plane, leaving South Vietnam for Taiwan. He was accompanied by his family, close aides, and 15 tons of personal luggage. Rumors circulated that Thieu had taken 16 tons of gold from South Vietnam's treasury, but this was never proven. In 2015, Vietnamese sources claimed the gold had actually been seized by the communist government and used for debt payments to the Soviet Union. Exile in Taiwan, 1975 to 1979. Thieu initially settled in Taipei, Taiwan, where he was given protection by the Taiwanese government. He lived in relative comfort, but was deeply depressed and bitter over the loss of South Vietnam. During these years, he refused all media interviews, avoiding public discussion of his failures as president. Life in London, 1979-1990s. A forgotten leader. In 1979, Thieu moved to London, where he lived for over a decade in near anonymity. He purchased a home in Kingston upon Thames, a quiet suburb of London. His children attended elite British schools, including Eton College. He rarely interacted with the Vietnamese exile community, preferring a low-profile existence. During this time, Thieu was almost completely forgotten in international politics. He refused to write an autobiography, fearing it would bring further criticism. He rejected offers from journalists, declining to discuss his role in the war. However, his bitterness toward the U.S. remained strong. He saw the fall of South Vietnam as a betrayal by the United States, particularly by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who had promised continued military support, but ultimately withdrew all aid. The move to the United States, 1990s-2001. By the early 1990s, Thieu moved to the United States, settling in Foxborough, Massachusetts. His decision to move was likely influenced by the large Vietnamese refugee community in the U.S., particularly in California and Texas, a desire for greater privacy, away from European media, the hope that he could still have some political influence among Vietnamese exiles. Despite these hopes, Thieu remained reclusive, rarely appearing in public. He lived in a modest home, largely avoiding public events. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, distant figure, walking his dog but seldom speaking about his past. The Vietnamese exile community was divided over Thieu. Some saw him as a symbol of South Vietnam, a leader who had been abandoned by the United States. Others blamed him for South Vietnam's fall, accusing him of corruption, incompetence, and cowardice for fleeing in 1975. Rare public statements and political views in exile. Though largely silent, Thieu made a few rare public statements in the 1990s, mostly criticizing the communist government in Vietnam. He predicted the eventual fall of the Vietnamese Communist Party, believing that it could not hold power forever. However, his hopes for a democratic Vietnam never materialized, as the communist regime remained firmly in control. The United States' role in Vietnam's fall, he repeatedly blamed the U.S. for betraying South Vietnam, arguing that the 1973 Paris Peace Accords were a death sentence for his country. He criticized Henry Kissinger for negotiating a deal that allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain in South Vietnam, effectively ensuring the eventual communist takeover. The Vietnamese exile community. Thiệu offered to act as a representative for the Vietnamese diaspora, advocating for reconciliation with Vietnam. However, most exile groups rejected his leadership, viewing him as a failed and disgraced president. Thieu's final years in death, 2001. By the late 1990s, Thieu's health began to decline. Though he remained mentally sharp, he suffered from chronic illnesses, including high blood pressure, diabetes, heart problems. In September 2001, Thiệu and his wife were in Hawaii, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, when the September 11 terrorist attacks occurred. This event deeply affected him, as both hijacked planes that hit the World Trade Center had departed from Boston Logan International Airport, near his home. According to his wife, the attacks triggered a psychological and physical decline, worsening his existing health problems. Thieu's death and funeral. On September 29, 2001, Nguyễn Văn Thiệu suffered a massive stroke at his home in Foxborough, Massachusetts. He was rushed to Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, where he died at the age of 78. His funeral was held on October 6, 2001 in Newton, Massachusetts. He was cremated, and the location of his ashes remains undisclosed. According to his wife, Mai An, Thiệu had expressed two wishes before his death. If Vietnam became democratic, he wanted to be buried in his hometown of Phan Rang. If Vietnam remained under communist rule, his ashes should be scattered at sea and in the mountains. Since Vietnam remained under communist control, it is unknown what happened to his ashes. Nguyễn Văn Thiệu spent 26 years in exile, living a life of regret and bitterness. He never returned to Vietnam, dying far from his homeland. He remained deeply resentful toward the United States, believing they had abandoned him in South Vietnam. Though he hoped to play a role in the Vietnamese exile community, he ultimately remained isolated. His legacy remains controversial. While some sympathize with his struggle, many view him as a failed leader whose corrupt and authoritarian rule contributed to the fall of South Vietnam. Part 9. Nguyễn Văn Thiệu Legacy and Historical Assessments. Nguyễn Văn Thiệu remains one of the most controversial figures in modern Vietnamese history. As the last full-term president of South Vietnam, his rule was marked by authoritarianism, corruption, and military failures, yet also by political resilience and a desperate struggle to preserve his country. His leadership ultimately ended in failure with the fall of Saigon in 1975, but the debate over his responsibility and legacy continues to this day. Historians, political analysts, and members of the Vietnamese diaspora remain divided on Thieu's role in the Vietnam War. Some see him as a leader betrayed by the United States, abandoned to face an impossible war. Others believe he was a corrupt dictator who mismanaged the war effort and hastened the fall of South Vietnam. Regardless of these debates, Thieu's legacy is inextricably linked to the larger story of the Vietnam War, the U.S. intervention, and the ultimate communist victory. 1. Assessments of Nguyen Van Thieu's leadership. Historians have evaluated Thieu's leadership through various perspectives, often focusing on four main aspects of his presidency. 1.1. Thieu as an autocratic leader. Thieu ruled South Vietnam as an authoritarian president, using martial law, censorship, and political repression to maintain power. He centralized power within the military and civilian government, making sure that he had total control over major decisions. Political opposition was crushed, with arrests of journalists, Buddhist activists, and dissidents. His 1971 election victory, where he ran unopposed, was widely seen as a sham. Thieu believed that South Vietnam needed a strong leader to survive the war, but his oppressive tactics alienated many South Vietnamese citizens. This weakened internal support for his government, making it more vulnerable to communist advances. 1.2. Thieu's military leadership, strategic failures, and corruption. As a military leader, Thieu's decisions were often marked by hesitation, miscalculations, and personal distrust of his own generals. His abandonment of the Central Highlands in March 1975 was a disastrous mistake, leading to the rapid collapse of ARVN forces. His micromanagement of military operations frustrated many ARVN commanders, as he often overruled tactical decisions. Corruption within the ARVN weakened military effectiveness, as supplies meant for soldiers were stolen or sold on the black market. Despite receiving billions of dollars in U.S. aid, South Vietnam's military never became fully self-sufficient. Many blame Thieu's lack of reform and patronage politics for the ARVN's failure to hold against the communists. 1.3. Thieu's relationship with the United States. Betrayal or dependency? Thieu's relationship with the United States was complex. While he relied on American military and economic support, he also resented U.S. interference in South Vietnam's affairs. He initially welcomed U.S. intervention, believing American troops could help defeat the communists. However, as the war dragged on, he became frustrated with U.S. leaders, especially Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, for negotiating the 1973 Paris Peace Accords without his full approval. He saw the U.S. withdrawal in 1973 as a betrayal, feeling that South Vietnam was left to fight alone against a stronger enemy. In his final years, Thieu continued to blame the U.S. for abandoning his government, arguing that if the U.S. had kept its promises, South Vietnam could have survived. 1.4. The final collapse. Who is to blame? Historians remain divided over whether Thieu deserves full blame for South Vietnam's fall. Arguments against Thieu. His authoritarian rule weakened domestic support. His military decisions in 1975 led to panic and chaos, accelerating the collapse. His government was corrupt and ineffective, allowing the communists to gain momentum. Arguments defending Thieu. The U.S. cut funding and military support, making it impossible for South Vietnam to survive. He was forced to sign a flawed peace treaty that allowed North Vietnamese troops to stay in the South. The South Vietnamese people never fully supported the war, making defeat inevitable. 2. Thieu's reputation among the Vietnamese exile community. 2.1. Supporters' views. The leader who was betrayed. Some members of the Vietnamese diaspora, particularly older anti-communist exiles, see Thieu as a leader who fought courageously but was abandoned. They argue that no leader could have saved South Vietnam after the U.S. withdrawal. They blame America's loss of willpower rather than Thieu's decisions for South Vietnam's downfall. Some view him as a symbol of lost Vietnam, a leader who did his best in impossible circumstances. 2.2. Critics' views. A corrupt and weak president. Others, including many younger Vietnamese refugees, see Thieu as a failed leader whose poor governance contributed to South Vietnam's collapse. Many blame him for running a corrupt, authoritarian regime. Some believe he should have stayed and fought in 1975 instead of fleeing. Others argue that his paranoia and distrust of his generals led to bad military decisions. In exile, Thieu was never fully embraced by the Vietnamese diaspora. While some respected him, most did not trust him to lead any political movements after 1975. 3. Thieu's place in history. In Vietnam today, Thieu is portrayed negatively by the communist government. Official narratives describe him as a puppet of the United States, responsible for war crimes and oppression. His rule is used as an example of why communism was necessary to unify Vietnam. His government is seen as corrupt, weak, and dependent on foreign powers. In the United States and Western historiography, Thieu's legacy is more complex. Many American historians see him as a flawed but determined leader, forced to fight a losing battle. Some describe him as an intelligent but overly cautious strategist, whose lack of trust in others weakened his military. Others argue that he was a product of his time, caught between a powerful enemy, a disengaging ally, and a divided nation. Modern historical comparisons. Some historians compare Thieu to Chiang Kai-shek, who led nationalist China but was forced to flee to Taiwan after the communist victory. Others see similarities between Thieu and Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, who fled Afghanistan in 2021 as the Taliban took over. Like many leaders of failed states, Thieu's legacy is defined by defeat, leaving historians to debate whether his failure was avoidable or simply inevitable. Nguyen Van Thieu's legacy remains one of controversy and debate. To some, he was a brave but unlucky leader, abandoned by his most powerful ally. To others, he was a corrupt dictator, responsible for South Vietnam's downfall. In the end, history remembers him as the last president of a lost country, a man whose rule ended in defeat, exile, and regret. Despite his flaws, Thieu's story is an essential part of Vietnam's modern history, representing the rise and fall of South Vietnam and the tragedy of a war that divided a nation forever. Part 10. Final Reflections on Nguyen Van Thieu's Impact on Vietnam and the World. Nguyen Van Thieu's life and presidency were deeply intertwined with the rise and fall of South Vietnam, a state that existed for just 21 years, 1954-1975, before being absorbed into a unified communist Vietnam. As the longest-serving president of South Vietnam, 1967-1975, Thieu played a crucial role in shaping his country's fate, its war efforts, and its relations with the United States. His leadership left a lasting impact, not just on Vietnam, but on the broader Cold War, U.S. foreign policy, and the Vietnamese diaspora. Although his rule ended in failure and exile, his legacy continues to be debated by historians, political analysts, and former South Vietnamese citizens. Was Thieu simply a leader who fought an unwinnable war, abandoned by his allies? Or was he a corrupt autocrat whose leadership flaws helped doom South Vietnam? The truth is likely somewhere in between. This final section examines Thieu's lasting impact on Vietnam, the United States, and the world. 1. Thieu's impact on South Vietnam. 1.1. A divisive leader, the strengths and weaknesses of his rule. As president of South Vietnam, Thieu ruled during one of the most difficult periods in Vietnamese history. His presidency was marked by military resilience. He held power for nearly 8 years, keeping South Vietnam afloat despite internal instability and communist aggression. Diplomatic skill. He navigated a complex relationship with the United States, securing billions in military aid. Some modernization efforts. His government attempted land reforms and economic development, but these efforts were largely ineffective. However, his rule also had severe flaws. Authoritarianism. He banned opposition parties, controlled the media, and rigged elections. Corruption. His government was plagued by bribery, nepotism, and incompetence, weakening the war effort. Military failures. His indecisive leadership in 1975 contributed to the rapid collapse of South Vietnam. 1.2. The fall of South Vietnam. Inevitable or Thieu's fault? Some historians argue that South Vietnam's fall was inevitable, regardless of who led the country. The U.S. withdrawal in 1973 left South Vietnam militarily and economically weak. North Vietnam had full Soviet and Chinese support, while South Vietnam had shrinking U.S. aid. The South Vietnamese military and political structure was inherently unstable. However, critics argue that Thieu's leadership failures accelerated the collapse. His mishandling of military retreats, especially the Central Highlands disaster in 1975, led to panic and disintegration. His repression of political opponents weakened domestic morale. His lack of trust in his generals led to poor battlefield decision-making. Even today, Vietnamese historians remain divided on whether South Vietnam could have survived longer under better leadership. 2. Thieu's impact on U.S. foreign policy. 2.1. A symbol of America's failure in Vietnam. For the United States, Thieu represents the limitations of American military intervention. The U.S. invested heavily in South Vietnam, providing over $140 billion in military aid, adjusted for inflation. Despite this, South Vietnam collapsed quickly after U.S. withdrawal, raising questions about the effectiveness of nation-building efforts. Thieu's fall reinforced American fears about supporting weak, corrupt allies in foreign wars. 2.2. The Nixon-Kissinger betrayal. Thieu's bitter relationship with U.S. leaders, especially Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, remains a major historical debate. In 1972, Nixon promised severe consequences if North Vietnam violated the Paris Peace Accords. When North Vietnam launched its final offensive in 1975, Nixon was gone, and the U.S. did nothing to help South Vietnam. Many in the Vietnamese diaspora believed Thieu was set up to fail, forced to sign a peace deal that ensured his country's collapse. This has had a long-term impact on U.S. foreign policy, leading to more skepticism toward military interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, greater reluctance to support weak governments without clear exit strategies, caution in forming military alliances with unstable partners. Thieu's fall became a case study in the limits of American power, influencing U.S. military thinking for decades. 3. Thieu's impact on the Vietnamese diaspora. After 1975, millions of South Vietnamese refugees fled the country, forming large exile communities in the United States, France, Canada, and Australia. 3.1. The divided legacy among exiles. Thieu remains a controversial figure within the Vietnamese diaspora. Some older exiles view him as a patriot who did his best in an unwinnable war. Others blame him for their exile, believing he mismanaged the war and abandoned his country too soon. Younger Vietnamese Americans rarely discuss him, focusing more on cultural preservation than Thieu's political legacy. Unlike figures like Ngô Đình Diệm, Thieu never became a strong symbol for anti-communist movements abroad. His quiet life in exile and refusal to organize political resistance left him largely forgotten by younger generations. 3.2. The absence of Thieu in modern Vietnam. In Vietnam today, Thieu's name is rarely mentioned in official history books. The Vietnamese Communist Party portrays him as a corrupt American puppet. His leadership failures are emphasized, while his role in resisting communism is ignored. Unlike Diem, who is sometimes viewed with sympathy, Thieu is mostly dismissed as irrelevant. Today, most young Vietnamese inside Vietnam know little about him beyond propaganda narratives. 4. The broader historical significance of Nguyễn Văn Thiệu. Thieu's presidency was part of a much larger Cold War struggle between the United States and communist powers. His rule reflects the challenges of fighting insurgencies, building stable democracies, and managing foreign military interventions. 4.1. Comparisons to other leaders. Thieu has been compared to Chiang Kai-shek, Taiwan, another leader who lost his country to communists and lived in exile. Ashraf Ghani, Afghanistan, the U.S.-backed Afghan president who fled in 2021 as the Taliban took over. Mohammad Najibullah, Afghanistan, 1990s, the last leader of Soviet-backed Afghanistan, abandoned when the USSR collapsed. In all these cases, foreign-backed governments struggled to survive once their main allies withdrew. The final verdict on Thieu's legacy. Nguyễn Văn Thiệu remains a deeply controversial and complex figure. Was he a courageous leader? Some say yes, as he fought for years against a powerful communist enemy. Was he corrupt and incompetent? Many say yes, pointing to his rigged elections and failed military decisions. Did he deserve to be abandoned by the U.S.? This remains a hotly debated question. What is certain is that Thieu's name is forever tied to the fall of South Vietnam, marking him as one of the most significant figures in Vietnamese history, for better or worse.